You brought a museum piece to a Tier 1 competition, Sergeant? And what? You're here to make us all coffee. The crowd of hardened operators and international marksmen rippled with a wave of condescending chuckles and nervous laughter. The man who had spoken, Captain Vance, stood with his hands on his hips, a perfect picture of spit-shined arrogance, his voice echoing across the high desert firing range with practiced authority. He was the range master, the self-appointed gatekeeper of this hallowed ground, and he had singled out the one participant who didn't fit his narrow mold. The target of his scorn, a sergeant whose nameplate simply read Morgan, offered no reaction. She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't even meet his gaze. Her focus remained entirely on the task at hand, methodically unpacking a long, heavy case that held her rifle. Her silence was a vacuum in the swirling vortex of Vance's ego, a calm that seemed to irritate him more than any retort ever could. But when the four-star general observing from the distant command tower raised his binoculars, he wasn't looking at the captain's performative bluster. He was looking at her stance, the economical way her hands moved with a practiced grace that spoke not of inexperience, but of thousands of hours of ingrained muscle memory. He saw a professional. If you believe that true respect is earned in silence and proven through action, type competence below. The very air at the Fort Irwin National Training Center seemed to shimmer with a mixture of blistering heat and palpable tension. This wasn't just another training exercise. It was the annual International Advanced Marksmanship Summit, a gathering of the world's most elite snipers. Men from units like the British SAS, the German KSK, and the U.S. Army's own Delta Force were present, their state-of-the-art rifles looking more like science fiction props than conventional firearms. They were draped in carbon fiber, titanium, and advanced polymers, adorned with scopes the size of small telescopes and ballistic computers that promised first-round hits at impossible distances. They were the titans of their craft, and their presence filled the air with a competitive, almost predatory, energy. And then there was Sergeant Morgan. She was of average height and build, her uniform clean but clearly well-worn, faded by sun and time in a way that no amount of starch could replicate. She wore no high-speed sponsor patches, no morale insignia, just the simple black and gold of her rank and her name. Her equipment, starkly visible against the backdrop of cutting-edge gear, seemed to confirm Vance's ignorant assessment. Her rifle, the M82 Barrett, was a legend, but a legend from a bygone era in the eyes of these modern shooters. It was heavy, brutally simple, and lacked the delicate, surgically precise aesthetic of the newer bolt-action platforms. To Captain Vance, it was an antique, a sledgehammer in a room full of scalpels, and its owner was, by extension, an anachronism. His prejudice was a thick, cloying fog, poisoning the atmosphere as he continued his verbal assault, circling her position like a vulture. He saw her gender, her unassuming demeanor, her older equipment, and his mind, clouded by assumptions, connected these superficial dots into a conclusion of incompetence. He was a man who confused volume with authority, and her quiet, methodical focus was an affront to his entire worldview. He believed strength had to be announced, that skill had to be advertised. Morgan's quiet discipline was a language he simply did not understand, and like all things he failed to comprehend, he chose to mock it rather than investigate it. The other teams watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of amusement and discomfort. They were professionals, but the tribalism of elite units was a powerful force. They saw an outsider, an unknown, being put in her place by the local authority, and most were content to let the spectacle play out. They had their own missions to focus on, their own reputations to uphold. They did not see the subtle details the general saw from his perch. They didn't notice the way Morgan had positioned her shooting mat at a precise angle to the prevailing wind, a calculation made instantly and without instruments. They didn't see the worn leather of her data book, its pages filled with the neat, dense handwriting of a scholar of ballistics. They didn't recognize the almost imperceptible way she tested the tension of her bipod legs, ensuring a perfectly stable platform. They saw an unremarkable woman with an old rifle. The general, however, saw the quiet ritual of a master preparing her canvas. He had seen that same focused calm in the eyes of bomb disposal technicians in Baghdad and in the steady hands of trauma surgeons in Kandahar. It was the unmistakable signature of someone who had faced the ultimate pressure and had not been found wanting. It was the calm of absolute competence. Captain Vance, emboldened by the crowd's tacit approval and Morgan's continued silence, escalated his campaign of public humiliation. He treated her like a clumsy recruit who had stumbled onto the wrong range, his words dripping with a condescending paternalism that made several of the foreign soldiers shift uncomfortably. "Sergeant," he began, his voice laced with mock concern, "this is a very advanced course of fire. The targets are at extreme long range, and the wind conditions out here are notoriously treacherous. Are you absolutely certain you have the right qualifications to be here? We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself, or more importantly, embarrass the U.S. Army in front of our international partners." His statement hung in the dry air, an insult wrapped in the thin guise of professional concern. He was not just questioning her skill. He was questioning her very right to wear the uniform in this elite company. He gestured vaguely toward the other shooters, men who looked like they were carved from granite and steel. These gentlemen are the best of the best. They live and breathe this work. They haven't just passed basic rifle marksmanship. The implication was clear and venomous. She was a novice, a diversity inclusion who had somehow slipped through the cracks and ended up where she didn't belong. Morgan, however, continued her setup, her movements a study in practiced efficiency. She attached her scope to the rifle's Picatinny rail, the click of the locking levers sounding unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. She produced a torque wrench and meticulously tightened the rings to a precise specification, an act of professional diligence that many of the other shooters, confident in their factory-installed setups, had skipped. Vance saw this not as professionalism, but as tentative slowness. "Still playing with your Legos, Sergeant? The competition is scheduled to start this century. If you don't mind," the laughter this time was more subdued. The initial humor of the situation was beginning to curdle into something meaner, something more uncomfortable. A few of the older non-commissioned officers on the periphery exchanged uneasy glances. They recognized the toxic leadership on display, the brittle ego of a man who needed to tear others down to feel tall. But Vance was an officer, and the range was his domain. Their silence was a form of complicity, a quiet surrender to the established hierarchy. Morgan finally finished her setup. The M82, which Vance had dismissed as a museum piece, sat solidly on its bipod, its long, fluted barrel pointing downrange like a silent finger of judgment. She lay down behind it, her body sinking into the earth as if she were taking root. The rifle became an extension of her own form, a seamless union of soldier and steel. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't acknowledge the crowd. Her world had shrunk to the padded eyepiece of her scope and the shimmering mirage dancing over the desert floor thousands of meters away. This complete and utter lack of reaction was her most powerful defense. It rendered Vance's insults inert, leaving them to hang in the air and expose his own insecurity. He had expected fear or anger or at least a stammered defense. He had received nothing. He was shouting at a mountain, and the mountain was not listening. From the observation tower, General Wallace lowered his binoculars for a moment, his jaw tight. He knew men like Vance all too well. They were the hollow pillars of the military institution, strong on the outside, but lacking the core of true leadership that came from humility and respect. He had seen them rise and fall, their careers often cut short by their own hubris. He made a mental note to review the captain's fitness report later. For now, he raised the binoculars again, his focus entirely on the quiet sergeant. He watched her check the parallax on her scope, her fingers making a minute adjustment. He watched her consult a small weather meter, her eyes flicking back and forth between the device and the subtle sway of the distant wind flags. She was collecting data, building a firing solution in her mind with the quiet intensity of a grandmaster playing chess. The general felt a growing sense of anticipation. He had a feeling that Captain Vance and everyone else on this range was about to receive a masterclass in the art of the quiet professional. The lesson was about to begin, and the tuition would be a heavy dose of humility delivered from over a mile away. The silence was the prelude, the calm before the storm she was about to unleash. The announcement crackled over the range's public address system, the voice of the lead official cutting through the tension. "Shooters, prepare for the first course of fire. This is the Kingmaker event. You will have one shot, cold bore. The target is a 24-inch steel silhouette at a range of 2,500 meters. Wind is variable from your 2 o'clock, gusting from 8 to 15 miles per hour. Shooters, you have 3 minutes to prepare. Firing will commence on my mark." A collective murmur went through the crowd of competitors. 2,500 meters. Over a mile and a half. It was a Spec Ops fantasy shot, a distance that pushed the very limits of ballistic science and human skill. The target itself would be a barely perceptible speck in even the most powerful scopes, and the gusting, shifting crosswind was a nightmare. A 1-mile-per-hour miscalculation in wind speed would result in a miss of several feet. This wasn't a test of marksmanship. It was a test of meteorological prediction and sheer, unadulterated talent. It was designed to produce failure, to immediately separate the truly elite from the merely excellent. One by one, the world's best snipers took their turn. A British operator, using a state-of-the-art accuracy international rifle, held for wind, his shot kicking up a cloud of dust 10 feet to the left of the target. A German KSK shooter, his face a mask of concentration, fired, his bullet landing low and right. The story repeated itself down the line. The high-tech equipment, the ballistic computers, the years of training. None of it was enough to tame the savage physics of this particular challenge. Frustration began to mount. The confident swagger of the morning was replaced by the tight-lipped grimace of professionals being humbled by an impossible task. The faint, mocking silence from the distant target was more damning than any critique. Then came Morgan's turn. She was the last on the line. A wave of pity and morbid curiosity washed over the onlookers. If the best-equipped men in the world were failing, what chance did the quiet woman with the old 50 calories have? Captain Vance stood behind her, his arms crossed, a smug smirk plastered on his face. He was practically salivating at the prospect of her inevitable, spectacular failure, the final, perfect validation of his prejudice. "Don't be nervous, Sergeant," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just try to hit the right continent." But Morgan didn't hear him. She was in a different world now, a state of profound and absolute focus. Her preparation was a silent, hypnotic ballet of precision. She didn't rush. She adjusted the small sandbag under the stock of her rifle with millimeter precision, ensuring the crosshairs rested naturally on the target without any muscular effort. She took a final reading from her Kestrel weather meter, noting the temperature, the barometric pressure, the humidity, the density altitude. She scribbled a few final calculations in her worn dope book, her pencil moving with unshakable certainty. She wasn't guessing. She was solving a complex mathematical equation. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing slowing to a meditative rhythm. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. Her heartbeat, which for others would be hammering with adrenaline, slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. She was detaching herself from the pressure, from the watching eyes, from the weight of expectation. There was only the rifle, the wind, the target, and the unblinking laws of physics. She became a living instrument, a human component in a system designed for a single purpose: to deliver a small piece of metal to an exact point in space and time, a mile and a half away. She settled behind the scope, her cheek finding its familiar place on the stock. The world outside, the circular lens vanished. There was no Captain Vance, no crowd, no competition. There was only the problem, and Sergeant Morgan was here to solve it. The final moments before the shot stretched into an eternity. Through her high-powered scope, Morgan watched the mirage, the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. To the untrained eye, it was a simple distortion. To her, it was a visible representation of the wind's complex dance, a river of air she had to navigate. She saw the subtle shift as a gust picked up, watching the image of the target ripple and drift. She didn't fight the wind. She waited for it. She was waiting for the lull, the brief, predictable pause between the gusts that her instruments and experience told her was coming. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, not with pressure, but with a patient stillness. Her entire being was focused on this single, fleeting moment of opportunity. The range officer's voice crackled. "Shooter is on the clock." Captain Vance's smirk widened, anticipating the hurried, panicked shot of a novice. But Morgan's calm remained absolute. Her internal clock was the only one that mattered. Then she saw it. The mirage flattened for a split second. The wind flags downrange drooped almost imperceptibly. It was the lull. Her moment was now. Her mind sent a single, clear command. Her lungs exhaled half their air, finding the natural respiratory pause. The crosshairs settled just to the left of the target, holding for the spin drift and the slight breeze she knew would persist. Her fingers squeezed the trigger with a slow, steady pressure that was less a pull and more of a release. The M82 erupted with a deep, concussive boom that was more felt than heard, a thunderclap that rolled across the valley. The massive rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and controlled violence she absorbed with a practiced ease, her eye never leaving the scope. She maintained her follow-through, watching her own trace, the faint, fleeting vapor trail of the bullet, arc gracefully towards the heavens on its long journey. For 3.5 seconds, the world held its breath. The heavy, 700-grain bullet tore through the air, spinning at thousands of revolutions per second, a tiny vessel navigating a vast and hostile ocean of atmospheric variables. It climbed, reached its apogee hundreds of feet above the line of sight, and began its long, elegant descent back to Earth, pulled by gravity and nudged by the wind she had so perfectly judged. The crowd watched the distant target, a silent, collective prayer on their lips. Vance stared, his smugness momentarily forgotten, caught up in the sheer drama of the bullet's flight. Then it happened. A sound. Not the dull thud of a miss hitting the dirt berm, but a sharp, high-pitched ping that was almost too faint to be believed. It was the unmistakable sound of copper-jacketed lead striking hardened steel, a sound that traveled back across the mile and a half of empty space to announce an impossible success. For a moment, there was nothing. The boom had faded, the bullet had arrived, and the world was left with a profound, deafening silence. The wind itself seemed to have stopped in shock. The other shooters, hardened operators who had seen everything, simply stared. They looked from the distant target back to the quiet woman, now calmly ejecting a spent brass casing. Captain Vance's jaw hung open. The smirk was gone, vaporized. In its place was a mask of raw, slack-jawed disbelief. The color drained from his face. His entire world, built on a foundation of loud assumptions and superficial judgments, had just been demolished by a single, perfectly placed shot. He managed to stammer a single phrase, a whisper of pure incredulity that was swallowed by the immense silence. No way. That's not possible, but it was possible. And it had just happened. The impossible had been made real, not with fanfare or boasting, but with quiet, devastating competence. Into the stunned silence strode a figure of immense authority. General Wallace descended the steps of the observation tower with a deliberate, unhurried pace, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The assembled soldiers, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking foreign officer, instinctively parted for him, their attention shifting from the distant target to the approaching four-star general. His face was a stern, unreadable mask, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on one person alone. He walked past the line of multi-thousand-dollar rifles and their bewildered owners without giving them a second glance. He walked past a visibly shattered Captain Vance. Ignoring him so completely, it was a more profound rebuke than any verbal reprimand. His path was direct, his purpose clear. He stopped at Sergeant Morgan's firing position. She was already in the process of disassembling her weapon for cleaning, her movements as methodical and unhurried as they had been during her setup. She had performed a feat of legendary skill, and her immediate response was to perform the simple, professional duty of weapon maintenance. She acknowledged the general's presence with a slight, respectful nod, but did not speak. General Wallace returned the nod, his gaze sweeping over her position. He looked at the heavy M82 rifle, now resting in its case, with a newfound appreciation. He saw the worn dope book, its pages a testament to years of dedicated study. And then, as he walked past her, his eyes caught something. He froze mid-stride. There, pinned discreetly to the collar of her uniform, almost entirely hidden by the fabric, was a small, unassuming device. It wasn't a medal or a standard unit crest. It was a small, circular pin, forged from a dark, non-reflective metal. It depicted a stylized owl with a sword clutched in its talons, its eyes seeming to glow with a hidden intensity. To 99.9% of the people on that range, the pin was meaningless, a small personal affectation perhaps. But to General Wallace, a man who had spent 40 years in the deepest, most shadowy corners of the military world, it was like seeing a ghost. It was the unofficial crest of a unit that did not exist on any official roster. A unit whose budget was a black hole, whose missions were never acknowledged, and whose members were handpicked from the absolute apex of the special operations community. They were the ghosts, the problem solvers, the final option when all other options had failed. They were spoken of only in hushed whispers in secure facilities, a modern myth with a lethal reputation. Task Force Orion. The general's expression shifted instantly from professional respect to something bordering on reverence. The impossible shot suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It wasn't a lucky guess. It was simply another day at the office for someone of her caliber. He turned on his heel, his voice cutting through the air with a new, urgent authority. He looked directly at his aide, a young lieutenant who had been trailing him. "Lieutenant, give me Sergeant Morgan's file. The unredacted one. Use my alpha-level clearance." Now the aide, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, scrambled to comply, his fingers flying across the screen of his encrypted tablet. The mystery of the quiet sergeant was about to be officially and spectacularly solved. The aide returned in less than a minute, his face pale, his hand visibly trembling as he held out the secure tablet to the general. The weight of the information he had just accessed seemed to press down on him. General Wallace took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. The assembled crowd of operators watched in absolute silence, sensing that a foundational truth of their world was about to be rewritten. The general cleared his throat, but he did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every soldier on that range was straining to hear his every word. He began to read from the file, his voice steady and authoritative, each word landing like a precision-guided munition. Name, Master Sergeant Eva Morgan. He paused, letting the corrected rank sink in. She had been wearing the uniform of a lower grade, a common practice for members of her unit to maintain a low profile. Unit, classified. Task Force Orion, asymmetric warfare group. A wave of shock rippled through the soldiers who understood the reference. It was real. The legend was real. The general continued, his voice a relentless staccato of undeniable fact. Combat déploiement, Seventeen. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the Horn of Africa, and other locations designated top secret/SC. The sheer number was staggering. More than entire platoons accumulate in their careers. Confirmed engagements, 312, a collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a number that placed her in the pantheon of history's greatest marksmen. Longest confirmed shot, 2,815 meters. Target was a high-value enemy commander. Shot was taken from an unstable platform on a moving naval vessel, the Kingmaker shot. The impossible feat they had all just witnessed was not even her personal best. Medals and commendations, Distinguished Service Cross. Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters. Bronze Star with Valor Device. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. Presidential Unit Citation. Special Qualifications. Master Instructor, U.S. Army Sniper School. Graduate of Ranger School, Sapper Leader Course, Special Forces Qualification Course. Mission Classifications. Designated Tier 1 Operator. Specializing in direct action, special reconnaissance, and counterterrorism. The list went on. A litany of elite schools, heroic awards, and secret missions that painted a picture not of a simple soldier, but of a living weapon, a national asset of the highest order. General Wallace finally looked up from the tablet, his gaze finding the ashen face of Captain Vance. The general's voice dropped, becoming quiet, cold, and utterly devastating. "Captain Vance," he said, the words precise and sharp. "You stood on this line, and you publicly berated the most experienced and decorated combat sniper in the entire United States Armed Forces. You questioned the equipment of a woman who has forgotten more about ballistics than you will ever know. You mistook quiet professionalism for weakness, and you mistook humility for incompetence. You have failed as a leader, you have failed as an officer, and you have dishonored this range." He let the condemnation hang in the air for a long, brutal moment. Then, he turned his back on the disgraced captain. He faced Master Sergeant Morgan, who had finished cleaning her rifle and was now standing at ease. General Wallace drew himself up to his full height, his posture perfect, his movements crisp. He executed a slow, formal salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was the salute of a warrior acknowledging a master of his craft, a gesture of profound and unequivocal respect that transcended rank. "Master Sergeant Morgan," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity. "It is an honor to have you on my range." The sound of dozens of hands simultaneously striking rifle stocks echoed across the desert as every soldier on the line, American and foreign alike, followed their senior's lead and rendered a salute of their own. Arrogance had been silenced. Respect had been commanded. The story of what happened on that high desert range spread not like wildfire, but like a shockwave. It traveled instantly through the encrypted text messages of the operators who had witnessed it, their words a flurry of disbelief and newfound reverence. You won't believe this. The quiet sergeant from yesterday? She's Orion by evening. The tale was being told in hushed, awed tones in the barracks at Fort Irwin, in the mess halls at Fort Bragg, and in the ready rooms of air bases halfway around the world. An anonymous post appeared on a popular, unofficial military forum under the title, "The Day a Four-Star Saluted a Sergeant." It described the entire event in breathless detail. The arrogant captain, the museum piece M82, the impossible 2,500-meter shot, the reveal of the Orion pin, and the general's public validation. The post went viral within the military community, shared thousands of times. It became an instant legend, a piece of modern military folklore. Seasoned veterans added comments of their own, sharing half-believed rumors they had heard over the years about the Ghost unit and its operators. The story resonated so deeply because it touched upon a fundamental truth of military life. That true worth is often found in the quietest corners, far from the spotlight and the self-promoters. For Captain Vance, the fallout was swift and severe. He wasn't formally reprimanded, at least not on paper. The general's public dressing down was punishment enough, a humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his career. But the event changed him. The brutal demolition of his ego forced a period of intense and painful self-reflection. The next morning, he sought out Morgan. He found her not on the range, but in the base library, quietly reading a book on advanced meteorological science. He approached her without his usual swagger, his posture stooped, his eyes downcast. "Master Sergeant," he began, his voice barely a whisper. There are no words. My behavior was inexcusable. It was unprofessional and dishonorable. I am truly sorry." He offered no excuses, no justifications. It was a simple, sincere, and complete apology. Morgan looked up from her book, her expression neutral. She listened to him, and when he was finished, she simply nodded. "We all have a job to do, Captain," she said, her voice calm and even. "Focus on yours. Ensure the men and women on your range are treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of their rank or their equipment. That's how you can make it right." She didn't offer forgiveness because it wasn't hers to give. She offered a path forward, a professional course of action. Her grace in that moment was as profound as her skill on the range. It cemented her legend not just as a great sniper, but as a great leader. Vance walked away a humbled and ultimately a better man. The lesson had been brutally delivered, but it had been received. The shockwave of her actions was not one of destruction, but of reconstruction. The International Advanced Marksmanship Summit continued for the rest of the week, but its entire character had changed. The atmosphere of cutthroat competition had been replaced by one of collegial learning and mutual respect. The focal point of this new environment was Master Sergeant Morgan. The other competitors, the elite operators from around the world who had initially viewed her with suspicion, now approached her with a quiet reverence. They didn't challenge her. They sought her counsel. A grizzled veteran from the Australian SAS, a man with a chest full of medals of his own, found her after a training session and asked, "Ma'am, that hold off for the wind. I've never seen anyone read the Mirage like that. Could you show me what you were looking for?" Morgan, without hesitation, spent the next hour with him, sketching diagrams in the sand, explaining the subtle physics of light and air, sharing the hard-won knowledge of a lifetime spent mastering her craft. She mentored a young Army Ranger, helping him refine his trigger press. She discussed ballistic coefficients with a German engineer. She offered her knowledge freely, without ego or condescension, her words always sparse, precise, and impactful. She taught them that the most advanced piece of equipment is the disciplined mind of the operator behind it. The physical landscape of the range was also permanently altered. The specific firing point from which she had made the Kingmaker shot became an unofficial landmark. Younger soldiers, hearing the story, started referring to it as Morgan's Perch. The name stuck. Range control eventually bolted a small, simple brass plaque to the concrete shooting bench. It didn't bear her name or rank. It was engraved with only the date, the distance to 500 m, and a single word. Competence. It was a silent, enduring testament to the day's events. In the main range control tower, the official photograph of the competition winners was hung on the wall. But next to it, in a place of equal prominence, was a different photo. It was an unofficial snapshot taken by one of the range officials in the moments immediately following the shot. It showed Morgan, still lying behind her rifle, her face a mask of serene focus, her eyes still looking downrange. In the background, the blurred figures of the other shooters could be seen, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. The image captured the very essence of the quiet professional. Calm at the center of the storm, her actions speaking with a volume that no shouted boast could ever hope to match. The photograph and the plaque became institutional artifacts, their stories passed down to every new group of soldiers who trained on that hallowed ground, ensuring that the lesson of that day would never be forgotten. A year passed. The dust of the high desert had long since settled, but the legacy of Master Sergeant Morgan's visit had taken deep root. The story of the Kingmaker shot was now a foundational piece of institutional folklore at the Army Sniper School. Instructors used it as a teaching parable on the very first day of the course, a powerful lesson about the dangers of assumption and the supreme virtue of humility. The tale was used to strip away the ego of new recruits, to remind them that the loudest voice on the range is rarely the most skilled, and that true strength is measured not in words, but in performance. It was a story about how a single, perfectly executed action could recalibrate an entire culture, reminding everyone that respect must be earned through demonstrated competence, not demanded by rank or reputation. Captain Vance was still the range master, but he was a profoundly changed officer. He had become one of the most ardent keepers of the Morgan legend. It was he who now personally told the story to every new class of snipers, using his own ignorant prejudice as the narrative's central point of failure. "I looked at her," he would say, his voice filled with the quiet gravity of a man who had learned his lesson the hard way. "And I saw everything but the soldier. I saw her gender, I saw her quiet demeanor, I saw a rifle I thought was outdated. I judged the cover and was proven to be a fool. Do not make my mistake. Look for competence. It is quiet, it is humble, and it is the most dangerous thing on the battlefield." His personal testimony gave the story an undeniable power, turning his greatest professional failure into his most effective teaching tool. Master Sergeant Eva Morgan, true to her nature, had vanished. Shortly after the competition, she had been reassigned, moving on to the next undisclosed location where her unique skills were required. She left behind no forwarding address, no personal mementos, only an empty locker and a legend that grew with each retelling. Her legacy was not etched onto a trophy or framed in a hallway. It was alive. It was in a more respectful way officers now spoke to their non-commissioned officers. It was in a renewed focus on the fundamentals of marksmanship over a reliance on expensive technology. It was in the quiet confidence of a new generation of soldiers who learned that their true worth was not defined by the patches on their sleeves or the volume of their voice, but by the silent, unwavering discipline they brought to their craft. She had proven that a true professional's impact is not measured by the noise they make, but by the standards they set and the positive change they inspire in others. True strength, the kind that endures and inspires, is rarely found in the boastful proclamation or the theatrical display. It does not demand attention, for it is confident in its own existence. It resides in the quiet places, in the steady hands of the master craftsman, in the unwavering focus of the dedicated scholar, and in the silent discipline of the consummate professional. It is a force that is felt rather than heard, a presence that commands respect through action, not assertion. Master Sergeant Eva Morgan was more than just an exceptional soldier. She was the living embodiment of this principle. She walked onto a stage filled with peacocks and, without saying a word, demonstrated the supreme power of the eagle. Her silence was not a weakness, it was a shield. Her humility was not a liability, it was her camouflage. She operated from a place of such deep and unshakable competence that the petty insults and ignorant assumptions of lesser men could find no purchase. They simply washed over her, as insignificant as dust in the wind she knew so well how to read. Her single, perfect shot did more than just strike a distant steel target. It was a moral statement. It was a physical manifestation of the idea that truth, skill, and dedication will ultimately triumph over prejudice and arrogance. It shattered a wall of ignorant assumptions and, in the ensuing silence, created a space for respect to grow. The legacy she left behind was not a memory of one incredible feat, but a living, breathing change in the culture of the institution she served. She taught an entire community that the most valuable asset a warrior possesses is not the weapon in their hands, but the character in their heart. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in your wake. It is what continues to move forward in the people you inspire, a quiet ripple of excellence spreading ever outward. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.